Indeed, Mr Bailey. It's a great pleasure to see you in the chair. And one of the great privileges, of course, of being back on the backbench is that I am able to not only participate in these debates, but apply for them. So I'm very grateful to the House for agreeing to have this particular debate. And I beg to move that this House has considered the role of devolved governments in negotiations to leave the European Union. This debate follows, Mr Bailey, on the back of my EDM number 325. One of the other unenviable privileges of being on the backbenches is early day motions can now be used, and I hope that all the members will be able to sign my EDM once they've heard this particular debate. Normally I would say, Mr Bailey, it's a great pleasure to be having this particular debate, but in many ways this was a debate we weren't having. The repercussions of our vote to leave the EU will be profound and far-reaching in Scotland and indeed across the United Kingdom and indeed across the European continent as a whole. And already we're beginning to see the impact on our own economy. The value of sterling has fallen against the euro and indeed the dollar and most other international currencies and remains highly volatile in doing so. Many businesses have predicted that Brexit will have a negative impact on their fortunes, and the IMF has revised down its forecasts for UK growth and said that Brexit risks throwing, and I quote, a spanner in the works of the global economy. Those of us who campaigned to remain in the EU warned of these obvious consequences and others as the probable outcome of a vote to leave. And what was dismissed as project fear by many, we are now seeing as being project fact, emphasised by today's survey of German businesses, which concluded that 56% of them would want a hard bargain when negotiating with the UK. Now, we have to deal with what's in front of us and get the best possible solution for the UK, and for the purposes of this debate and my own responsibilities, the best deal for Scotland. The evidence suggests that support for leave was strongest in the most deprived areas of our country. I witnessed that myself, Mr Bailey, at the Glasgow Counting Centre in Scotland, and in my own constituency, the more affluent the area, the larger the Remain vote. Now, we have a responsibility and indeed a duty as politicians to reach out to people who voted leave and to strive to understand why and respond to their particular concerns. And I suspect increasingly they feel they have no stake in society. In general terms, although this isn't necessarily always true, these are communities where the ravages of deindustrialisation have been hit the hardest and where the economic recession has bitten the deepest. And in many ways, there are pronounced similarities here with the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, where some of the most deprived communities in Scotland voted to leave the UK. They also felt disillusioned and disenfranchised in large numbers, and many of them had cast a vote, or had not cast a vote, in many years, if at all. There's a clear problem here for us to address, to which we must find an amicable solution, a solution that reconnects these communities to the political process and proves that politics can and will be a power for good in their lives. And we must not let this Conservative government, or indeed the Scottish Government, or any government for that matter, to abdicate their responsibilities and abandon those who need help the most. Immigration is an issue that came to dominate the EU referendum debate, and it is a concern that must be addressed. But is it immigration that is the true cause of deep satisfaction felt in communities, or is it other things, such as 6 years of public service austerity, the lack of proper house-building strategy, failure to recruit adequate numbers of GPs, a dearth of well-paid, progressive, highly skilled work, crushing pressure on schools and hospitals? These factors are not failures of the EU, they are failures of national governments, north and south of the border. And as such, they can all be resolved by a sea change in UK and Scottish government policy. We shouldn't allow, particularly the UK government, to hide behind the EU for these public policy failures. Rather, we must reassure... I'll have to give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree with me that those of us that can see that immigration enriches us as a society, and we have a particular issue in Scotland of a demographic challenge, which can only be aided by those coming to live and work in Scotland. And we need to encourage people to do that, whether it's through the post-study work visa or EU citizens that wish to come, those that are here. But we need to talk about how immigration enriches us and not demonise those that wish to come and live and work and make a contribution to our society.
And Mr Mr Bailey, that's precisely my point. Immigration does enrich society, and I think politicians have to be much braver about making the case, the positive case for immigration. But all of that has to be, there's not mutually exclusive arguments here, all of that has to be set alongside the fact that if you do have an influx of people, whether that be through migration or other purposes, work or otherwise, that public policy responds to that. And the previous Labour government did have the Migrant Impact Fund that was precisely that kind of response to local communities who were in need of additional resources to deal with the impact of movement of people, whether that be immigrants or otherwise, that was scrapped in 2010 by the current government, and something that we should look seriously about bringing back. None of these issues are mutually exclusive, and I absolutely agree with the honourable gentleman, who not only was wonderful at intervening, but has successfully meant that I have lost my place. I'll get used to being back on the backbenches very shortly indeed. So, Mr Bailey, I was saying that we should reassure both those that voted to leave and those that voted to remain that we are listening to them by just demonstrating, not just through speeches and word, but by indeed by our action, that we are firmly on the side of everyone who voted in this EU referendum. And in doing so, our first priority, and a priority that needs to serve the interests of people across the entire country, should be to secure the best deal possible in the Brexit negotiations. That means adopting a negotiating stance that takes all views into account, those that voted to leave and those that voted to remain. And the building blocks for these negotiations must be what we want to retain from the European Union. As Scottish Labour's Westminster spokesperson, my focus today is obviously on Scotland, but I'm sure many from the other devolved administrations and nations, Northern Ireland, who voted, of course, to remain, Wales, and my honourable friend is here from Wales, who voted to leave, should also have their say in these particular negotiations. And I'm sure honourable members from Wales and Northern Ireland will want to make those particular points. But let's just reflect on the vote in Scotland for a moment. 62% voted to remain and 38% voted to leave. In my own constituency of Edinburgh South, Mr Bailey, 78% voted to remain. And I assume that was in no small part due to the contribution of the significant financial services sector to the economy in Edinburgh, the large number of small businesses who export, the universities, the world-class universities who rely on EU funding for some of their world-leading research and development. These factors all have to be taken into account as we set out our negotiating stance. So let me just go through Labour's priorities and Labour's principles for what those negotiating stances should be. I'm happy to take it, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. And he mentions his voters and the financial sector in Edinburgh. Does he accept that Scotland remaining within the EU provides an opportunity for businesses to look north to Scotland, particularly in the financial sector, for those who are considering leaving London? There is an opportunity for his constituents, for Edinburgh, for other cities in Scotland and for Scotland overall.
Absolutely. And as I come on to the conclusion of my particular remarks, you'll see that we should be looking at this as an opportunity, not just for Scotland, but across the United Kingdom. We are where we are, and we need to make sure that the negotiations from this government reflect the fact of what's happened, not just in Scotland, but across the other component parts of the UK, and make those particular arguments. And I do hope that the financial services sector in the UK, and particularly in Edinburgh, reflect on where we are and will make those decisions accordingly. And if I could reflect on the uncertainty that's been brought about by this particular decision to leave the European Union, it's a similar uncertainty with any constitutional change that we must deal with. And I'm delighted that my honourable friend from Livingston did intervene, because it meant that I was able to mark my paper, Mr Bailey, of where I sat down. So we're certainly getting the hang of this, and I do appreciate that. So let me just go through the founding principles that form where I think everything else in these negotiations should flow from. And we must be mindful and respecting and upholding the will of the Scottish people, not just in this particular referendum, but of course in the independence referendum in 2014 as well. And those results have shown us that Scots wish to remain part of the United Kingdom and retain the advantages of membership of the European Union. Now, I understand that's not a particularly easy thing to achieve, but these should be the founding principles of what we want to achieve from these negotiations. And that is Labour's starting point, and forms the basis of what we believe should be Scotland's negotiating platform. It's a platform informed by an excellent and aptly named paper written by Professor Jim Gallagher of Nuffield College in Oxford. The paper is entitled "The Brexit Shambles," charting a path through the rubble. So I think you can perhaps guess from the title where he's coming from in this particular issue. And it identifies and delineates 4 priorities by which the Scottish Government and the UK Government should be guided. Actually, I've added one to make it 5 because it doesn't mention the role of EU nationals, and I think that's quite important to put that on record as well. And as matters stand as we are here today, Scotland belongs to 2 unions and gets advantages, significant advantages from both. The people of Scotland recognise this and have recently voted overwhelmingly for both unions to be continued. The result of these referenda should be respected, but instead they are being ignored. And the political context in Scotland at the moment is thus. The Conservatives want Scotland in the UK, but out of the EU. The Scottish National Party wants Scotland in the EU, but out of the UK. And it's only the Scottish Labour Party that is clear that we want Scotland to remain in the EU and in the UK. And the UK and Scottish governments have an obligation to pursue every avenue in pursuit of this outcome. And in order to facilitate this, I think we should look at the priorities that should be put in place. Scotland's first priority should be to urge the UK government to accept a Norway-type option, if I can use that terminology. I will allow you on the Norway-type point, yes.
It's the previous point to Norway. I'm very grateful. He's a decent man. He makes the point that he doesn't want to see referendum results ignored, but he then goes on to state the Scottish Labour's position is to keep Scotland in the UK and the UK in the EU. Given that that is not what people voted for across the UK, does he not perhaps consider his party's just behind the curve on this issue?
What I should have done in the intervention was ask the honourable gentleman if he would sign my EDM, which he probably won't given the content of it. But I think if he was listening properly, I said that Scotland's position and what the people of Scotland have voted for through the 2 referendums that we've had is a position where Scotland is in the UK and retains the advantages of being in the European Union. I didn't say that in terms of the way the UK is to remain in both, because quite obviously not. I will take the intervention if, in taking the intervention, the Honourable Lady will confirm or deny whether or not she will sign my early day motion.
Well, first of all, I have to say I will, thank you very much, Mr Chair. I need to read his early day motion before I make a decision on that. It would not be appropriate to make a comment either way without the prior knowledge. Just a brief point to make, though. Does he not recognise that many people in Scotland voted for independence on the basis of things that his party and other UK parties said that Scotland, the only way to retain Scotland's place within the EU was to vote against independence?
Really, I'm sure you'll rule me out of order if we rehearse the well-trodden paths of the arguments around the Scottish referendum, and I will touch on some of those if the Honourable Lady doesn't mind as we go through this contribution, being knowing the time, knowing it's the last day of term and everyone's desperate to head to the shores of Spain without a visa to enjoy the sunshine with their families. So I will get on to that as we go through. The first option, Mr Bailey, in terms of the Norway-type option, is that we would have membership of the European Economic Area. Now, the UK and hence Scottish membership of the EEA would mean maintaining much of the same conditions of trade and freedom of movement as currently exists. Now, I'm not sure if the government's position with regards to the negotiating position is to maintain the free movement of people, but the Norway-style option would allow that to continue. And it's worth putting in context why that's important. The value of Scotland of unfettered access to the EU single market is well established. Indeed, the Scottish Government's own figures value Scottish exports to the EU member states at around £12 billion annually. However, it's worth reflecting on the same figures that show Scottish exports to the rest of the UK, which is why this is such an important debate for us to have, because they are worth 4 times that amount at £49 billion a year, which is why I think the Scottish people have voted twice to stay within the advantages of being in both unions. So it makes scant economic sense to prioritise the EU market over that which is provided by the UK. In this particular debate, it can't be an either-or. We should strive to maintain access and full access to both. So UK membership of the EEA would allow Scotland to continue trade undisrupted with both the EU and the UK. If this provides impossible, then a separate trading deal would have to be negotiated. Nobody knows what that would look like. And the other option, which I think is an unpalatable option, at the other end of the spectrum, would be to abide by the World Trade Organisation rules, and that would have significant impact on the UK and Scottish trading capacity. The second priority, Mr Bailey, should be to protect Scotland's public services and public spending by securing a continued fiscal and political union with the UK. These are the building blocks for the negotiations. Now, I know the Scottish Government attaches huge importance to its fiscal relationship with the UK. The former Finance Secretary extended, in his own words, every sinew to protect it during the negotiations of the fiscal framework underpinning the current Scotland Act. And the Scottish Government accounts and independent analysis show that Scotland is carrying, at this point in time, a substantial budget deficit. So it's incredibly important that the UK's position and Scotland's position within the UK, through the block grant, through the Barnett formula, is maintained in that particular fashion, because without these mechanisms, the Scottish Government would have to undertake dramatic spending cuts or increasing taxes in order to balance the books based on its current own annual accounts. And that's been reflected on by the member for East Lothian, the SNP's representative on the Treasury Select Committee, who did say that not having those fiscal transfers would be incredibly difficult. In fact, I think the word he used was catastrophic in terms of Scottish public services. That brings me to the third priority, Mr Bailey, and that's for the protection of Scotland's currency union with the rest of the United Kingdom. And many of these arguments, as we've just discussed, particularly with the intervention, were covered in 2014. However, it is worth in this context revisiting them, because it's incredibly important for this debate around how your negotiation with the EU goes, if your first principle is to ensure that Scotland remains in the UK and indeed remains with the benefits of the European Union. Now, we know the euro is a non-starter, so that can come off the table, and we should owe the former Prime Minister and Chancellor Gordon Brown a debt of gratitude for keeping us out of the euro. But what of other currency options that may be available? Well, we know that the only currency option that is best available at the moment is the current settlement that we have. So there must be part of the negotiations in terms of the Scottish Government and the UK Government's Brexit negotiations with the European Union, making sure that Scotland's position in the UK is protected, because Scotland's position with regards to fiscal and economic union with the rest of the UK is beneficial for the other currency arguments. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I won't run through those currency arguments, Mr Bailey, but they are all on record in terms of where we are, and the preferred arrangement in terms of Scotland's fiscal, currency and economic position is with the current arrangements, and that it must be underpinned by the negotiations and reject all others. Let me quickly skirt through the fourth priority, and that's to explore all options for our future relationship with the EU. Because if we view this positively, this could turn the Brexit negotiations on their head, transforming a vexatious trial into an unprecedented opportunity, and the Honourable Lady from Livingston mentioned that previously. No one has ever suggested that the EU is a tremendous success, and there are elements of it that Scotland may wish to relinquish. Equally, there are parts that Scotland may wish to retain. And one aspect of the Brexit debate rarely mentioned is that it will greatly empower the Scottish Parliament. So many of the competencies, control over fisheries, over agriculture, university research funding, environmental policy, will transfer directly to the Holyrood Parliament. And as the academic, I will very briefly.
I promise this will be the last intervention. I'm very grateful for him being so generous. On the point that he makes, would he accept that Scotland within the EU having a seat at the top table, and he makes the point about the EU not being perfect, but we could have a greater voice and greater influence in reforming the EU if we were an independent country within the European Union?
But that flies in the face of the arguments of economic, of currency, of political union with the United Kingdom, and essentially turning your back on a much more successful union in order to be part of the European Union. And I think what people have said quite clearly, both in the Scottish context and in other contexts, is that you want Scotland to be part of the UK and part of the EU. And if your journey to where you want to get to in terms of these negotiations is an independent Scotland, which I'm sure it is, and if it wasn't, I'd be incredibly surprised, then your journey and your pathway to get there is slightly different from having a pathway and a journey towards an outcome that is to keep the UK together and to keep Scotland with many of the advantages it currently has of the UK being a member state of the European Union. And that should be part and the genesis of these negotiations. I do appreciate the outcome of that journey from a Labour Party perspective and from a Scottish National Party perspective is different. But my contention is that that journey has to be about keeping both unions together. Let me just go to what Michael Keating said, Mr Bailey, who recently observed that the Scottish Government could choose to align itself with all these new powers that we're talking about that will go to the competence of the Scottish Parliament with the EU in terms of the directives that are currently in existence, as opposed to the UK. And it can either have an informal or formal relationship. But the key thing here is that there will be new and interesting opportunities to look at. If we look at air quality, just as one example, the responsibility for delivering air quality in Scotland lies with the Scottish Parliament, but it's under the EU directive, and the intergovernmental working between the UK and Scottish governments mean that the English and Welsh policies to deliver those directives and the Scottish policies can be different, but under the same umbrella. There will have to be some kind of intergovernmental strength of working to make sure, in that particular example, and many, many others, are delivered across the United Kingdom. Let me just go to two very brief comments, if I may, before I conclude. The first one is the piece of work that's been commissioned by Lord Falconer in the other place, the former Secretary of State for Constitutional Affairs. He's looking at setting out some options of a federalised membership structure. Many say that this is impossible to achieve, but actually, if you look at the uncharted territory that we are currently in, everything should be on the table in terms of examining the possibilities for protecting the component parts of the United Kingdom in terms of their membership and the advantages of the European Union. I think the fifth and final principle that should guide these negotiations, particularly from a devolved perspective, is protecting the rights of EU nationals who live, work and contribute to the United Kingdom, and conversely protecting the rights of UK nationals to work, study and live in other EU countries as well. And that should be the fifth guiding principle. I'm conscious of time, Mr Bailey, so let me just conclude by saying that the UK political landscape is changing rather rapidly. We can see that a week is certainly a long time in politics these days. And Brexit is perhaps the reckoning that the political system has been needing for a long time to readdress where we are in terms of the political landscape and how we respond to the big issues of communities. Because there's no doubt that the basic things that people took for granted, a job, a decent wage, a home of their own, a secure pension in old age, making sure the next generation does equally as good, if not better, than the current, are increasingly becoming unattainable. Whether that's in fact or perception, it is indeed what people tell us. So people are working harder, they're doing the right thing, but not receiving the benefits, and I think that's at the genesis of why the UK voted to leave. And that's not a failure of the EU, all those are a failure of, indeed, national governments. So let's just reflect on, finally, where we are, and I'd like the Minister to perhaps address some of these issues. If we take the principle that the conclusion we want to get to is to ensure that the UK comes out of the EU, but Scotland stays in the UK and maintains many of the advantages of being in the EU, if we accept that as a principle, that should guide the negotiations that the government has with the devolved administrations and indeed the European Union. So the Minister has the opportunity to set out the position of the UK government with regards to the devolved nations today and the administrations, and be clear that the Brexit negotiations will protect their interests. The Minister should also reaffirm that the UK government will recognise that Scotland voted to be in the UK and keep the advantages of the EU, and those will be the foundation stones and building blocks from which the negotiations should take place. Because if we're optimistic about this, and we all have the same journey and the same outcome that we want to make sure that those are the conclusions that we seek. Finally, Mr Bailey, the former leader of the Labour Party, the Right Honourable Member for Doncaster North, said in a Tony Benn Memorial Lecture just last week, and I quote, "This can be a progressive moment. In any case, there is no point in the left sinking into gloom. The only answer is to rise to the challenge. The optimists have always been the people we need at times of greatest adversity. Today we need them more than ever." So I hope the Minister is indeed an optimist and will respond positively to this debate.